The most common question I've seen asked about DHPT is E1 or S1, and now that he's finally rerunning, how has the answer to that changed? There's a lot that can go into it, and I had a hard time deciding for myself during his original banner until I did a lot of the math contained in this video, so let's go over it and see if I can help at all for what might even end up being his only rerun. With a full comparison of all his early investment options, their utility, and the damage per screenshot. Starting with the damage for the first half of the video, and then we'll talk about the surprising priority for improving his sustain after the damage. I'll show the before and after for everything on Archer and Saber. The builds on both of them and their supports are not very good, and the footage was taken after his initial release, so things have changed. Sparkle doesn't have her Nova Flare, for example, but we still can't deactivate Eidolons or anything, so you'll very likely see higher raw numbers yourself, but the percentage gains should still be the same. I'm showing Saber too, but Archer's damage is the one you should focus on more here because of a few reasons, but mainly because I didn't manage to make all of her other buffs consistent, so the numbers vary a bit more than they should for her. So, starting with his E1, first is the damage without it. Showing it by just not activating his ult, seeing as the ult is required to actually get the res pen from the E1. And then here's just the exact same thing again, only this time he actually ulted and activated the E1's buff. No real surprise with the damage difference, it's 18% res pen, and without any other sources on the team, it should just simply be about 18% more damage. The other arguably even stronger part of the E1 though, the bonus SP it makes the ult generate, is unfortunately pretty impossible to show here in a damage screenshot. The damage it gives is basically impossible to simply quantify as it depends so much on the team and rotation, so we'll compare and talk about that a lot more later. After the S1. Comparing with E1 S0, because like I said, I've already activated the E1 and the signature also requires you to ult to activate its effect, so basically it has to be E1 S0 compared to E1 S1. Shouldn't really make a difference, doesn't really matter, the buffs don't dilute each other or anything at all, or affect the percentage increases of each other, the number will just be overall higher. It gives not just 36% damage, but also about a couple of hundred attack to the DPS. Because of how much more common these buffs are, the difference it makes will be far more variable. Even then, though, you can see it's still not quite as much of an increase versus an off-path light cone as E1 was. If you buy the Battle Pass, then the difference will be even smaller too. It's also a lot less for a character like Phynon, for example, thanks to how many buffs he stacks. Calculations show it is only about a 10% damage increase, much lower than the E1. Finally, for the E2's damage, let's keep his signature equipped, because with the relatively bad relics on characters, it's probably more comparable to most people's S0 damage. The dragon at E1 S1 does kind of mediocre damage here, but with E2 you can see it doubles, so that in full AoE, even with the bad builds, it's actually doing a fair bit. It will again also be much higher for a character like Phynon that stacks so many buffs, or with better relics. And it does more than just the double that the damage per screenshot shows though, it actually more than quadruples. Because not only does it also double the amount of attacks that it can do, it makes it so that for a lot of characters, you're now better off using an attack rope instead of an ER one. It really depends on the character though, but a lot will attack often enough that they will find it difficult to actually use up all of the enhanced dragon's charges before Dan Heng can actually ult again. Like Archer here for example, not only does he attack a lot, but all at once, so that really quite often he can just get in the dragon's way and end up not actually action advancing it that much. That can increase the damage his E2 gives by letting you change rope and give the DPS more attack. But it can also decrease it if you still can't actually use and get value out of all the charges. The action advance it gives the dragon will make that difficult, but it is very possible. Like I said, Archer, for example, kind of ends up getting in the dragon's way a lot of the time. So the overall percentage gain in damage will vary a lot and isn't something I can really show, but most calcs I've seen have it as a bit more of an increase than his signature. I'll link 2 calcs in the description so that you can see for yourself. In terms of longevity and future-proofing, his E2 is a bit more complicated though. Compared to his S1, it effectively provides a raw multiplier increase to the DPS, instead of typical damage buffs. This means that if future characters power creep by having better buffs and stronger supports, then the E2 can stay strong or even gain value over the signature over time. For example, if more future characters are like Anaxa with relatively low multipliers but high self-buffs, then his E2 will be a very effective increase for them. If though, on the other hand, future supports stay relatively balanced, and DPS just have increasingly higher raw personal multipliers, then his E2 will lose value in comparison to his signature. Don't focus on this too much though, because it will heavily depend, and the difference won't be very large. Even if his E2 does lose more value going forward than his signature, it is still unlikely that it loses so much value that the signature actually becomes a higher increase than the E2. The E2 is just very variable. Even currently, it gets a lot more value in AoE, and so hunt characters, for example, like Archer, can really benefit from it if the fight isn't pure single target. So that's like several ifs. At last, let's talk about the sustain. Here, S1 provides a good increase not just to his shields, but also by adding a heal, so that the team can better recover from any chip damage. Based on the math I did for the last video, over 13 Dan Heng turns at E0 with an off-path cone, he can provide 17,690 shielding. The S1 brings the shields up to 21,228. The heal then adds another 3,000 in sustain, for just over 24,000 total sustain. The shielding increase is only 20%, but including the heal, his signature increases his total sustain by about 37%. It isn't quite as simple as just including the heal though. As I've gotten to use him more, it's really clear how much more often the healing would be wasted compared to just more shielding. It's very unlikely the whole team will need healing, and if they do every single ult, you're probably fucked anyway. The shields can cap too, of course, but the difference is that the instant you take any damage, then you can recover them and get value from more shielding. Whereas you have to have taken thousands of damage before the healing can be used at all. It simply will be wasted more often. In reality, you really want more frequent recovery rather than just making what you're already getting stronger. Most of the time, rather than the ult just giving you a bigger chunk of sustain, what you really want is for either Dan Heng or the dragon to hurry up and give you more frequent shielding. The signature can help that by making you less worried about the shields ever breaking briefly, but in practice that is extremely rare and not really something to be worried about. In practice, it takes quite a lot of chipping to actually be a problem and put you in danger. The E1, on the other hand, because it makes the ult give a skill point, can give you both more frequent shielding and more total value. assuming you aren't already just skilling every turn with DHPT anyway, which you probably aren't. If you want the light cone because you're concerned about sustain, you can instead use the SP from the E1 that you otherwise would completely not have access to actually increase his sustain more than the signature. If you use all of the newly generated skill points on Dan Heng himself, you get 25,000 shielding from him in total, a 41% increase. More than even the signature with full value from its heal every single time. Without the heal, because it will so often be wasted, it is 18% more sustain than the S1. The E1 can, of course, also still lose value to being capped out, and because you don't have the signature, you have a lower cap. But, like I said, you want more frequent recovery, not just more in total, which doing this with the E1 will give you much more than the signature. And if you're losing a lot of value to the shielding cap, then you're probably not in a very dangerous fight anyway. And even if you are already skilling every turn though, the E1 gets you closer to the E2. Which absolutely eclipses both in terms of sustain. I'm not sure if it's just me that thinks it's worded a bit confusingly, but as you can hopefully see, it actually doubles the dragon's shielding every single time, not just when DHPT action advances it after his ult. Which it can read like at first, thanks to it saying this instance after it says the dragon gets action advanced. If it was only that one time the dragon acts after being advanced, it would generally provide the exact same increase as using the SP from his E1 to skill on him, depending a little on how much value you actually get from the action advance and how close the dragon's next action actually was. As it is though, it provides way more. Using the same assumptions as before, the E2 alone, without using the E1's skill points, and without even counting the action advance, as it's more likely to overcap thanks to being back-to-back applications, the E2 brings his sustain up to 26,840, including the action advance as a full extra dragon, because you can get full value without it overcapping in more dangerous fights where it actually matters and you actually care about how much he's sustaining. The total sustain from E2 is 34,160, making it a 26 to 41% increase over his signature. Combined with the E1's skill points, at absolute maximum, it is 41,480 shielding. All of that is without switching to an attack rope, which you very likely should do if you're combining the skill usage with the E2. The combination of each of the Eidolons providing more damage and sustain means the signature is just definitely his lowest priority, even with the Eidolon's increased cost of 90 pools on average versus 65 for a rate-up light cone. His S1 isn't without value, it's the only one that actually increases the cap of his shields if you don't switch to an attack rope, and the damage increase for most characters is good enough to be close to even their own signatures, so you could justify going for it instead of multiple DPS signatures. But his investment priority is definitely E1, then E2, and only after that his S1. The damage comparison between E2 and his signature is complicated, depending on the bond may and whether the content is single target or AoE, but the sustain difference isn't. And I'd argue neither is the fun difference. It's far more interesting and fun to have more and stronger cool dragon attacks and animations than just 36 more damage percent. especially for a character like Archer or Anaxa, who really appreciate the extra AoE ability to remove fodder. The only thing his signature really has over his Eidolons is some minor improved synergy. It makes him easier to use with Mortenax by giving Dept some healing and extending the amount of time you can use Mort's abilities before he gets stuck at 1 HP. But it's not worth it. If that's your only concern, you'd be better saving the pools for a future sustain made with Mort in mind. And even if you're committed to Dept specifically, you're still on a timer even with Dept's signature. You'd be better off just focusing on increasing your damage with his Eidolons so that you can clear before Mort's HP becomes too much of a problem. Especially if E2 is in the conversation, since it has extra synergy with Mort too anyway, with its increase to the team's attack frequency. And if it's Dept you're committed to, then it's him you should commit to, rather than over-prioritising synergy with the flavour of the month best support. There is at least more value to his signature with Blade in the picture now, especially with 24 of the 36 damage percent it gives being team-wide. It's a decent pool after his E2 if you're committed to putting that much cost into Dept. Otherwise, just go for his E1 and maybe you'll get lucky and get his E2 on the way as well. Thanks for watching, subscribe and go and check out my other videos, since I'm a small channel and need all the help I can get. Until hopefully next time, bye.